Hello, my name is Nina, welcome to my channel. I usually don't do a lot of sit-down content, but today I wanted to make a video all about my all-time favorite books. Now, I'm not saying that these are the best books ever written. These are the books that I consider my favorites because they are either very well written or they have a special meaning to me. They just for some reason are very special to me and I really wanted to share them with you. Before we start, I think it's good to know that I am someone who really enjoys reading books that make me feel very sad. That is definitely a theme throughout these books, is that I just love it when a book can make me feel emotional. And there's definitely a specific way in which it has to be done. Like, I want to be taken along a journey and then be so emotionally invested that when something bad happens to my characters, I just like feel it in my chest. So if you watch this video and you are interested in reading any of these books, please check trigger warnings before you read. Almost all of these books have specific triggers that it is very important to check beforehand. With some of these books, I might mention them specifically, but in general, for all of these books, make sure that you do your research, that you check trigger warnings, and you make sure that this is a book that you will also like to read. Because like I said, I really enjoy it when a book can make me cry, but if that is not your vibe, then maybe double check with all of these books. That being said, I have been a reader since I can remember. I loved reading as a child. I would always go to the library and pick up books there. And on my summer breaks, I would read like 20 books in one go. And I've always really enjoyed reading. Especially as a teenager, I think reading was a very good way for me to relate myself into the world and to see people that were going through the same things as me and just like feel connected. But then when I went to art school, I just completely stopped reading for a few years. So I read almost daily up until I was around 18, and then I started my studies and I didn't read for 4 years. And then after I finished the study, almost the same month, I immediately got back into reading. So I always divide my reading experience into those two life chapters. Before art school, I was a child, I was a teenager, I was going through specific things. I was mostly looking for recognition and for community and for understanding the world and myself. And then after art school, I got more into maybe serious reading. I kind of left the young adult kind of books behind and I started reading more contemporary fiction, more non-fiction. And in this pile, you can tell that there's a few books that I read before my reading break and that I still think about and still have impacted me. And then there's a few books that I read after that are more maybe my current taste. I hope that makes sense. I just wanted to explain that maybe some of these are not the best books or not books that I would still consider very well written, but because I read them at a certain time, they impacted me so much that they are still some of my favorites, even though I maybe wouldn't call them my favorites if I read them for the first time right now. Alright, let's get into the first book. The first book I wanted to talk about is Dear Edward. Now, this book, I don't even know where I found it because I read this book as one of the first books after my reading break. And this is a book that I don't hear enough people talk about. This book is a book about a plane crash. And only one person survives the plane crash, and it is Edward. And Edward is 12 years old. His whole family was on this plane. They all died, and he is the only survivor of this whole plane. It is dual timeline, where in one timeline you see everything that happens in the plane up until the crash. And then the second timeline is from the moment that the news breaks, people find out what happened, and you follow Edward in the years after his survival. This book is beautiful and so heartbreaking. I finished this book. This is a very vivid memory I have. I was sitting on the couch. I was still living at home when I read this book, and I was sitting on the couch and my parents and my brother were watching TV, and I was just like, oh, I'm gonna grab my book. Didn't think much of it. And then I read the final few chapters and I bawled my eyes out just on the couch, and my parents and my brother were just sitting there like, is everything okay? And I was like, this book is so sad but also so beautiful, because this book is clearly about death, but it's also so much about living. It is so much about being brave enough to really live and allowing yourself to live and not just being alive. The way you connect with Edward in this book is so incredibly special. Even though he's a 12-year-old boy, you understand him so well and you see him going through these heartbreaking things, but also still trying to be a child, still trying to find a way in this world. This book is inspired by real life events. It is not a real description of what happened, but it is inspired by something that really happens. But like I said, I think this book is so beautiful because it talks so much about living and about daring to live, even though you might feel like you should feel guilty for living. Allowing yourself to enjoy life and enjoy the little things, and also dealing with grief and loss is just, this is such a beautiful book. I wish this got like so much more hype and attention online because it is so beautiful. The second book I wanted to talk about is All the Bright Places. Now, I was gonna leave this out of this video because this is not a book that I would consider my favorite currently, but this was my all-time favorite book as a teenager, and this shaped me as a person and as a reader so much that I can't make a video without mentioning this. I know this went viral on TikTok a couple of years ago, but I read this in the John Green Hunger Games era. When I was 15, 16, this book was so special. This book is a dual POV between Violet, who has just lost her sister and is dealing with her grief, and Finch. And Finch is someone who struggles a lot with his mental health, and they become friends, they fall in love in a very beautiful way where they can really understand each other's pain. But this book also touches on the fact that people can make each other's pain worse, even though they don't mean to. It's about two very flawed people, two people who are going through a lot by themselves and them trying to be together, but also having to sacrifice a bit of yourself because the other person is in pain so much. And it asks the question whether loving someone is enough to save them. And that just, this book talks about mental health, it talks about grief, it talks about suicide, it talks about trying so hard to be better but not being able to, and also being forced to be better for someone else. This is, I don't know if it's as good if you don't have the emotional connection to this as I do, but I read this book, I think 10 times when I was a teenager. At one point I lost my physical copy of this book and I immediately bought a new one because I didn't want to live without it. And then I found the first copy again, so now I have 2 copies of this book because that is how special this book was to me. And I think this was the first time that I really connected to characters in this way, and that really shaped me as a reader. Talking about the John Green era, I think if you were a reader when like The Fault in Our Stars came out, that is just always going to be a big part of your journey as a reader. At least it is for me and a lot of my friends. But this book was already my favorite when I read the John Green books the first time, and I reread it about a year ago and I still absolutely loved it. Looking for Alaska is a book about a boy called Miles, and he moves to a boarding school because he just is very bored of his life. He feels like there's nothing going on and he wants to get the chance to really live. So he moves to boarding school with the intention to really start living his life. And in that boarding school he meets a friend group, and one of those friends is a girl called Alaska. And Miles becomes obsessed with her. When I read this the first time, I definitely thought that this was such a romantic book and such like a beautiful love story. But when I read it last year, I was like, this is more about being obsessed with someone in a way that you don't see their flaws anymore. You don't see their negative impact. You don't see the effect they have on you. And you let them get away with things that you would not let other people get away with just because you are so obsessed with them. You don't even really see them for who they really are. Now, say what you will about John Green, but I love the writing style of this. I think there are so many beautiful quotes in this book, and I think that if you are a teenager reading about teenagers written by John Green, you are going to recognize yourself in it. And I still think it holds up in terms of writing. I loved it when I reread it, and this will forever be a 5-star for me. The next book I want to talk about is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Now, I know, okay? I know there's gonna be people who see this and think, I can't trust her judgment, I am going to click away. But I am not saying that this is one of the best books ever written. I am saying that this is a book that impacted me as a reader a lot. Because this book is one of the reasons why I got obsessed with reading again after my reading break. And it didn't just get me back into reading. I know so many people around me who weren't into reading or aren't into reading, but loved this book regardless. And I think in that sense, it has a very special place. This is definitely an imperfect book, and I can talk about all of the flaws that I see in it, but I mostly just really enjoyed reading this. It was fun to read, there were interesting twists, there was a beautiful love story, there were painful moments. I just got swept away in this book, and it reminded me about how reading should make you feel. And I think there's definitely a reason why so many people online are raving about this book. It's just a book that really grips a lot of people and get a lot of people to love reading. And I think that's very special, and it was very special to me. Alright, we're moving into more of my adult favorite books, and the first book I wanted to talk about are actually 3 books. This is an autobiography series by Deborah Levy. Now, I didn't know Deborah Levy at all. I didn't know any of her writing, I didn't know who she was. I found this book because Leora was reading it and she read me a few pages and I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And then I bought the first book and I couldn't stop reading. These books are about Deborah Levy's life, they're about writing, they're about womanhood, they're about being a mother, they're about seeing and experiencing the world. And I don't know what it is about these books in particular, but these books have just never left my brain. I know exactly where I was when I read these books, what I was thinking, what I was feeling. I just have such vivid memories about these books, and I just remember feeling so entranced by them when I read them. The writing style just gripped me and it never let me go, and I just cannot stop thinking about these books. They are such a joy to read, and especially if you like autobiographies, but you also like more poetic writing and more maybe fictionalized writing, these books are a great read. These are high on my list on books that I want to reread, but I want to do that when they have the same feeling as the first time I read them. I don't know if that makes sense, but I read these books partially on a trip to France, and France is also a big part of one of these books where she is in France, and I wouldn't be able to reread these books in like the winter time when I'm at home. I need to find a moment where it matches the vibes of the first time I read them. Anyway, if you've never read these books, please consider picking them up because they are incredible. The next book I'm going to talk about is A Little Life. Now, I am going to specifically mention for this book that this book is incredibly triggering. You cannot go into this book blindly. There's like a multiple page trigger warning list online to find about this book. And please, please check those, all of those, before you even consider reading this. I am going to talk about this because it was a very special book to me, but I definitely don't want to give the impression that I am urging you to read this, especially not if this is about subjects that you are sensitive to. I'm going to try to talk about this book in the most sensitive way possible, but still, if you consider reading this, please check trigger warnings. This book follows a friend group of 4 people, and you follow them from university till like the end of their lives. And the reason that I and so many other people love this book so much is because of the way that you could get connected with the characters. You follow all of these characters from different POVs, but there is not a description of the POV before you start a chapter. It just says chapter 2, and then you start reading and then you have to find out whose head you're in. But at some point in this book, you get to know these characters so well that within a sentence, you know whose head you're in. It's just the way this is written just connects you to these characters so much. And the first part of this book is fully spent just like growing that connection. And then halfway through, you find out these things about one of the characters that they went through, that they never told anyone, that they didn't even really admit to themselves. And because you feel like you know these characters so well, it is so incredibly emotional and shocking and personal. It feels so personal to read about these things, because you're like, but why did you never tell me? Because I thought you trusted me. Even though obviously it's a book, it just, the connection is so strong. I just got so attached to the people in this book that I almost feel like they're real. When I finished this book, I felt like I was losing some of my friends. And this is a thick book, so you have a lot of time with them, but I was like, I wish I had more time with these characters. These characters just feel so real to me, and I feel like I know them, and I will never forget this book and how it made me feel. And then last, but certainly not least, is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This book is about two people who meet as kids and then reconnect as adults. They're called Sadie and Sam, and in their adult life they build a game company together because they are both really obsessed with video games. So they start making video games together and they become very successful. This is not a romance, but it is definitely a story about connection, about friendship, about relationships in a lot of different ways. And it's about how those things shift when things like success and money and fame come into play. It is also about creativity and how success can impact creativity and what it maybe can take from you. Like, is it worth it to give up creativity for success or for more money and fame? But this book also talks about racism, about sexism, about cultural appropriation, about class difference and growing up poor. There are so many things that this book talks about while just being about video games. And these characters are both very different, but you see both of their POVs on all of these topics, and they both have a very different background, very different views on things. So it makes you think, like, is there like a right and wrong in this situation? And because you kind of grow up with them, you can understand both of these characters very well. So you also understand where they are coming from in certain topics when they have like their own opinions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them. I think this book is a really great example of a book where it feels like a very casual story when you read it, but then there's so much depth and so much more meaning behind it that you kind of find throughout the story. So this is just an incredible book and incredible to read. So these are the books that I have talked about in this video that for me have the most special place in my heart, that I will forever consider one of my favorite books. I have been talking your ear off, so if you're still here, thank you so much. If you have any recommendations based on these books where you're like, oh, if you like this, maybe you will like that as well, please let me know, because I'm always open to that. And also let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. I really enjoyed just sitting here and talking about books with you, so if you also enjoyed, you can subscribe down below if you want to, and I will hopefully see you again next week. Bye!